Hello, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So, check out the new hairstyle, okay? Anyway, so this video is about the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, not the current holder of that great office, Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, but the Prime Ministership in general. And this is a month late. I intended to do it last month, but forgive me, I was distracted. I'm not going to come up with that lame-ass excuse, I didn't have time to make a 5-minute video, because it's just gone 300 years since the first person was appointed Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and as every child can tell, the first office holder was Sir Robert Walpole. So it was April 1721 when Sir Robert was appointed to this high office, that small-time landholder from Norfolk. So it was a plutocracy back then. Only men with a consequential amount of landed property were permitted to vote in those days, and even those with a very major stake in the country were allowed to sit in Parliament, and those obviously with certain hereditary titles were allowed into the House of Lords, and so those in the House of Commons were mostly close blood relatives of those in the upper chamber. So the title was initially actually First Lord of the Treasury, and then in common parlance was Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister and the First Lord of the Treasury were almost always the same person. In the late 19th century, I can't remember who it was. Was it Lord Salisbury was first of all Prime Minister, but somebody else was First Lord of the Treasury? But because Prime Minister, in a sense, didn't even officially exist, even though people appointed the post, till about 1911, when the table of precedence mentioned the Prime Minister, because obviously the monarch, the monarch's consort, the heir apparent, and so on, the heir apparent spouse, and blah blah blah, down to members of the royal family, down to whoever's next is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, and so forth, and eventually Prime Minister, the table of precedence. There are obviously hundreds of people at the top of the table who are listed as in the table of precedence is where they would get to sit at a state banquet or some sort of official service at Westminster Abbey or St Paul's Cathedral or something of that nature. So very soon the official residence of the Prime Minister became number 10 Downing Street, London. So that is a stone's throw away from Parliament, and it's called Downing Street because of the name of its first significant inhabitant, Sir George Downing, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1660s, had been a parliamentarian, turned his coat, became a royalist at the time of the Restoration, and indeed helped organise the abduction of his former comrades who fled to the Netherlands. That's Sir George Downing, who was possibly Irish. He might have been born in Dublin, but certainly he lived in Ireland for some time. You might think, that name rings a bell. Downing College, Cambridge? No, it's not him. It's his grandson, another Sir George Downing, who was the founder of Downing College, Cambridge. Much later, the Prime Minister got his country retreat, Chequers, which is in Buckinghamshire, because Viscount Leo Fareham, this aristocratic politician, left a bequest that his country estate would be given to the office of the Prime Minister, just in case there was a Prime Minister who didn't come from a background of blue blood and broad acres and didn't have a country seat to invite foreign dignitaries to. And so that's been the Prime Minister's country retreat since that time, well, for nigh on 99 years. So the Prime Minister, he's the Queen's first servant, and the Prime Minister increasingly took over the role from 1721 because, of course, George I had been on the throne since 1714. He was got that mainly by virtue of being of the Reformed faith, because, of course, upon the death of Queen Anne, the Act of Settlement had said they would pass over those 58 Catholic claimants who were closer to her in blood than to George, Elector of Hanover. He was a descendant from James I's daughter, Sophia. So George I came over to Great Britain and became monarch. He spoke English but poorly and didn't want to be there meeting with his ministers, so they can just meet without him and decide their business. And so increasingly, crown prerogatives were passed to the Prime Minister, and then he was exercising these in behalf of the monarch. And the tradition gradually emerged. The monarch would only act with the advice of the Prime Minister, which is largely legal fiction. Even the Supreme Court has recognised this, that the Prime Minister is ventriloquising through the monarch. So when the monarch makes public pronouncements, he or she is doing so only with the express say-so of the Prime Minister. Anyway, so if memory serves, there have been 54 Prime Ministers, only 2 of whom have been female. There's some debating about exactly how many Prime Ministers there have been. There was the Earl Waldegrave, or Walgrave, how you pronounce it if you're really being pedantic, and he was Prime Minister in the 1650s for a mere 5 days. There's also the Earl of Bath, who's Prime Minister for a mere 2 days, and it's dubious whether he was appointed at all. So possibly the number is different. Anyway, there have been 2 father and sons pairs, as you will know. There was Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger. They're both called William Pitt, which is why we can't distinguish between them on the basis of their Christian names. Pitt the Eldest, he was the great commoner, was finally elevated to the peerage with the title the Earl of Chatham, as in near his country seat in the fair Shire of Kent. So why was Pitt the Younger not also known as the Earl of Chatham? Well, that's because William Pitt the Younger was not the firstborn son. So his elder brother became Lord Chatham. And then there was George Grenville and Lord Wyndham Grenville, who were also father and son. And incidentally, they were cousins of the other pair. So therefore, we had 2 father and sons pairs who are close blood relatives. Now, people are always banging on about Dadabhai Naoroji, the first MP who was non-white. Well, it's true that Dadabhai Naoroji became elected Liberal MP in 1892. However, there was also Robert Banks Jenkinson, the first Earl of Liverpool, who was Prime Minister, a Tory, and became PM in 1812, and he was 1/8 Indian, so he was non-white, and this was no secret at the time. He had certain political nemesis, but his deadly foes never used it to his detriment. They clearly didn't see it as some sort of Achilles heel that they could attack him on. And there was that chap, Dice Ochterlony, who was an MP in the 1840s, who was half Indian too. So there were non-white MPs long before the Parsi narrow majority man came along. The old man of wherever they used to call him. Obviously there was Sir Mancherji Bhawnagri, who became Conservative MP after that, who was a stalwart imperialist. We had some Irish Prime Ministers, obviously the Duke of Wellington. There was Andrew Bernard Law. John Major's a quarter Irish. Well, Margaret Thatcher's 1/8 Irish. I think being 1/8 from Kerry is insufficient to qualify her as an Irish woman. Tony Blair's half Irish. And I can't think of the other Irish Prime Ministers at the time. Possibly the Marquess of Lansdowne, Irish. So a number of Irish Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom. And the rest aren't all English. They're Scots. As for Welsh, there's obviously David Lloyd George. But the Welsh don't seem to be particularly bothered whether people are Welsh or not. So what? They're British. It doesn't matter where they are. They're not going to discriminate. So that's a little bit about the office of Prime Minister. People since Margaret Thatcher's time saying, oh, they're becoming too presidential. People are no longer talking about what the Prime Minister's doing, what the government's doing, but what the Prime Minister. And are you primus inter pares or not? And you encourage cabinet debate or not? James Callaghan used to, but Margaret Thatcher said, well, this is the decision and so on, and not ask them to voice their opinions. Anything else you'd like to know about the Prime Ministership? Paid of the order of £150,000 a year. There is no term limit. The Prime Minister is whoever can command the confidence of Parliament, and that's really the House of Commons we care about. Of course, until 1902, most Prime Ministers were from the House of Lords, and there's not been a Prime Minister in the House of Peers ever since. Of course, with George V, when he chose to appoint Andrew Bernard Law Prime Minister, the other Tory contender was George Nathaniel Curzon, who was the Earl Curzon of Kedleston, said, I'm not laying down a doctrine that we'll never have a Prime Minister from the upper chamber again, but simply it wouldn't be apposite to appoint someone in the Lords, since Labour's got almost no peers, and we must have the main opposition party able to question and scrutinise the government in the House of Lords when the Prime Minister sits there. So, yes, is there anything else one would like to know about the Prime Ministership? Well, that's about it. Obviously, that's head of government of the United Kingdom. He's extensive powers of patronage. Now, Blair divested himself of many of these powers of patronage. These former prime ministers, they can write their memoirs, command a very fat fee for that, go on the international speaking circuit. They have done certainly since Thatcher, and they can get some very handsomely remunerated consultancies. And David Cameron's got himself into a spot of hot water over these, with Greensill and all that. Why would you choose a former prime minister as your consultant? Well, obviously there's the cachet. Moreover, he or she has the private numbers of all the top bureaucrats and politicians, and also can give you the inside story. Here's how you need to butter up so and so. This is what you need to say to her. That's an angle to that man. Do this, don't do that. Wise policy. That's the wrong approach. This is a much smarter way to do it. He or she can give you the lowdown on all these things. So they make an awful lot of money or they step down. Tony Blair's made tens of billions with this Tony Blair and Associates and Tony Blair Faith Foundation and so forth. Was the longer they're out of office, the staler they get, and they're no longer so useful. I mean, Sir John Major, he tends to keep fairly stum. The others are quite reticent. I mean, John Major's the eldest living Prime Minister. Obviously, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, now David Cameron. We've got 5 living former Prime Ministers, and none of them are particularly decrepit. Major is not quite 80. So, yes, I've met Margaret Thatcher. I met John Major. I met Theresa May before she became Prime Minister. I met David Cameron. I met Boris Johnson. The ones I haven't met are, in my lifetime, are Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, curiously, the two Labourites. That's enough from me, so please subscribe to my channel and book online lessons with me in history, politics, religious studies, citizenship, French law, geography, and so forth. Toodaloo.